The U.S. Treasury Secretary warns the country should expect a decline in the dollar's share of global reserves in the coming years. Janet Yellen made the remarks in response to a question at a Congress committee meeting. She said the use of U.S. sanctions has motivated certain countries to look for currency alternatives. Yellen, however, said that there is no alternative that could completely displace the greenback as the U.S. currency plays a role that no other country is able to replicate. Experts say the dollar's status as a reserve currency has seen gradual erosion for the past 2 decades, and it saw a steep decline in 2022. Over the past month, several countries have announced shifting away from the dollar in trade. That includes Iran, Russia, China, and some South American countries, among others. John Edmonds is an economist, academic, and author who joins us. John Edmonds, welcome. When you have the U.S. Treasury Secretary making this announcement, maybe that is going to sink in with U.S. officials, especially the Treasury Department that imposes the sanctions. Are we looking at, because this is now accelerated for the year 2022, as we just cited, in terms of this shift away from the dollar, up to a point, I'm guessing. What do you make of the announcement made there by Janet Yellen?
Well, I'm surprised she was so candid. Normally she would say something like that, not standing in front of a microphone, but there have been initiatives since the 1980s at least to create some other currency that would take the place of the dollar, or at least diminish the importance of the dollar. I remember when Japan was going to be the currency, the Japanese yen was going to be the currency that everybody used, but the Japanese yen didn't want it. Also, China has been mentioned that the RMB would be a possible replacement, but I don't see that one either because they don't seem to want that role. The question is, what would be the replacement? And there could be a created currency, for example, created by Brazil, India, China, and possibly South Africa working together. That has been discussed.
All right, well, you almost mentioned the BRICS countries there. I'm not too sure if there's a replacement that's going to happen, as you said. Perhaps there's going to be another currency that may be introduced, because BRICS, as a matter of fact, is thinking of doing that. They say they're going to announce it in August. But the more important question here is, what's going to happen to the way that the U.S. economy works in terms of its debt? When you have countries that are not buying the currencies, or should I say the U.S. Treasury bonds, if that's on the decrease, isn't that going to hurt the U.S. economy also, because it finances its debt through the sale of the U.S. dollars, if that's correct?
Yes. The burden of servicing the debt would rise because the interest rate in the dollar market is already higher. So when the Treasury wants to sell new bonds, they have to offer higher interest rates in order to be able to sell them. But the really bad show was a couple of weeks ago when the House of Representatives was really holding back on the debts, because normally in the House of Representatives, has a much bigger margin of seats. In this case, the margin is 322 to 213, and so with only 5 holding out and unwilling to raise the debt ceiling, they didn't have enough votes. It eventually had to be bipartisan, which they didn't want to do it that way, but they eventually had to, or they would have defaulted on the debts. So that was such a bad show that a lot of people really didn't believe it, and now they do believe it, and they believe that it'll come up again soon enough. And so they want to go to an alternative, and the alternative that you mentioned, a created joint currency by those 4. When they did that in Europe, it worked brilliantly because they had 12 currencies that unified together to create the euro. I say brilliantly because of the huge increase in the market value of real estate and bonds, but the individual countries had to give up their monetary sovereignty, which meant that they did not control their own currency.
Mm-hmm. And finally, I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Of course, if the U.S. changes its foreign policy posturing, does not apply sanctions through the weaponization of the dollar, and bully countries into aligning it with its interests, maybe this move to de-dollarize is going to decrease. Do you see that happening in the near future or on the horizon?
I wish I did, but I'm really afraid that I don't, because the U.S. has always rattled its saber, and that goes back to the Monroe Doctrine of 1820, asserting sovereignty, or not sovereignty, but influence over an area which was not really part of the United States, and still trying to influence policies of other countries. I mean, if you go back much more recent times, they were talking about regime change. Countries choose their regimes. And if you get involved in trying to interfere with that, it usually ends up badly for the country and for the intervening entity. You can certainly see that if you look at the history since World War II. But the U.S. still insists on asserting itself, and this coalition of emerging countries, the big ones, could create a currency that wouldn't have that attribute, but they would have to give up their monetary sovereignty. They could try to do it in some engineered way where they would not give up the monetary sovereignty over their own currency. And if they did that, then they could. But if they would have to give up their monetary sovereignty, the people that I know have all told me that China and India would not join. They would not join Brazil, and not really interested in joining with South Africa. And the other one, the other BRIC, let's not even mention those guys.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, John.